Welcome back to Reformed Millennials, the podcast where finances, economic trends, and sports intersect. Cam and Joel help listeners better invest their time and money. Also, it's important for listeners to understand that investing in equities, fixed income instruments, and/or alternative asset classes involves substantial risk of loss. Any action you may take as a result of the information presented in this podcast is your own responsibility. The information in this podcast is presented as a general educational, informational, and entertainment resource only. While Joel is registered to provide investment advice as an advising representative with Gold Investment Management, Ltd., a firm registered as a portfolio manager and located in Edmonton, Alberta, this podcast does not provide individualized investment, tax, or insurance advice, nor is it meant as a recommendation to any listener to buy or sell any specific securities or otherwise take any other form of investment action. This is an excerpt of the full legal disclaimer that's available on the landing page of this podcast, which includes whether Joel Shackleton, Cam Pitchers, or GIM have any ownership or interest in the specific securities discussed in this podcast.
All right, back Wednesday morning record.
Happy hump day.
Yeah, should we just do Wednesdays from now on? Probably makes the most sense.
It's kind of actually a nice little target to hit in the week, you know?
Well, the way I look at it is, since you're on vacation so much, the Friday and Monday that rolls over into your extended weekends, it makes it difficult, right? I mean, even the production guy is always away. It feels like I'm the only consistent person
For sure.
who can be there on Mondays and Fridays. So Wednesday might be
The new release day? Okay, I guess I can get on board with that and fit that into my schedule. I had to ask you something on the way here. Driving here, it was a bit congested coming in from Sherwood Park, always for us. I mean, you never know what's going to happen with traffic on the way in. And I don't want to sound boring talking about traffic on a podcast, but I was listening to, I think it's the Bussin' with the Boys podcast, the Barstool. It's like old football guys that have a podcast.
Okay.
And I just listened to clips. They're actually pretty funny guys. And they were talking about pet peeves the other day. And it happened to me just before coming here, what they were talking about. So when you get to a light and you're turning left and the person in front of you does not pull halfway into the intersection to then turn left, they wait at the stop line, which if there's any cops or traffic police out there that are going to tell me that is the correct thing to do, I don't care, because you're stopping everybody else from behind you from potentially making that light and congesting traffic. I just about had an aneurysm behind the person before coming here.
Is that at the Jasper Ave?
At the Jasper Ave turnoff, yeah.
109.
And just what goes through anyone's brain to not have the courtesy to pull out into the intersection so that at least two people can make a light as opposed to one, especially when we're talking about downtown driving.
Yeah.
And so the topic of pet peeves are just in my head after listening to that podcast clip, and then it actually happening to me no more than 24 hours later after hearing it and saying, this must rank in the top 3 for me. And you, being someone who gets pet peeved by everything, I wanted to bring that up to you and see if that was a ranking item for you as well.
You know what? That probably doesn't fall into my top 3 for even driving pet peeves. That being said, I could see it fitting its way in. The one that bothers me most is almost certainly the yields. People not taking advantage of merge lanes.
Oh, goodness gracious.
That's way worse. It's way worse. Stopping before a merge lane. It's just, I think what it speaks to is low IQ. And that might be sensitive for some that are a little bit worried.
It might be.
And maybe they're just learning. And if you're 16 years old listening to this, be cautious when driving. However, if you're 36, use that darn merge lane, or I'm going to be honking at you.
So look out for Cam and Joel losing their minds on that. Yeah. What do you think Adam Silver and Gary Bettman's pet peeves are right now in their leagues?
Definitely small markets winning.
And lack of competition, I would say.
Yeah, I'm sure they're really disappointed by that. It's nice to see the best player winning in the case of the Western Conference. With that said, LeBron making it to that final or the conference final was probably good for ratings.
Oh, that was really good. It's just the fact that, I mean, even if Denver and it looks like Miami, I know Boston won last night to push another game, but the fact that both series could be over now in 4 games and 5 games, and then there's going to be a break. I think the finals, at least are from a TV schedule standpoint, are not supposed to start until June 1st. I guess there could be some flexibility with that if something opens up with other availability. But the fact that you've had essentially zero competition, like I know I was quoted on this podcast saying a few weeks ago, when the playoffs were first starting, and saying how the NBA only gets better as they go on. And I mean, maybe to a degree it was like second round, maybe that happened, but usually you have 2 heavyweights kind of going back and forth, call it a 6-7 game series in the conference finals, and they're not getting that. And then to your point, LA and Boston, that would have been the ideal finals matchup for them. And now it looks like obviously LA is already out, and now Boston might be
on its way out
as well. So then you have this Denver, like, not saying that they both have like great stories, actually, to be honest, like I think easy to market for the NBA. You got 2 big stars, like kind of budding stars in Denver in terms Jokic, 2-time MVP, but in terms of like marketability to the entire league or the country or NBA fandom in general, he's still kind of just scratching the surface, I would say, just because he's not a very gregarious guy, pretty soft-spoken, from my understanding anyways. You don't see him on a ton of marketing material.
Yeah.
But, I mean, watching those guys play, they play basketball the right way. If you're a purist, I think people love watching them play. But again, you have Denver, and then potentially this ragtag group out of Miami led by, basically, we're seeing the best single playoff performance in terms of when you compare what Jim Butler in the regular season versus Jimmy Buckets Butler in the playoffs. Yeah. Just a completely different mindset. So I think there is still storylines, like we talked about how, again, NBA does such a good job marketing their stars, getting to that finals, trying to, I think, take lessons from the NFL in terms of making their games events and things you have to tune into. And I think they can still do it probably, but at the end of the day, they had a lot of things that happened that would go against what I said a few weeks ago, where it was like, oh, well, it's going to be, top 4 in each conference. You're going to have the superstars going against the superstars, and that's going to be that. And it's not really playing out that way this year. And then same thing with the NHL, right? I mean, really,
I haven't watched a minute.
Well, and I think we have to take that comment with a grain of salt a little bit, just because we've talked about obviously who we're fans of. Mm-hmm. And I think when you have a good team and you lose out, then you're not interested because you're jaded and don't want to follow it anymore. I think it's the same for, I've heard players comment on this as well. When you're a player that doesn't make the playoffs, you actually tune into more of it and follow it potentially more than the guys who hate their lives because they lost this opportunity. Like the guys who really love the game, obviously. Like, I mean, I can't speak for Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl. If I'm them, I'm not watching a single second after I lost that game, because all I'm going to think about watching is like, that could be me, like seeing like Vegas up 3-0 now, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, 3-0 as of last night.
I mean, it's over, basically.
Yeah. You just lose. You've just lost the team that's potentially in the finals, potentially got an inside track of winning the cup. But again, talking about team, like Gary's probably, again, losing, in my opinion, would be losing his mind. He's probably not, because again, it's always expansion babies that are making it through here. But essentially no drama for the most part in terms of the series. Now, there's been 4 overtime games, I think, in the Florida-Carolina series, whatever. It's still, it's an expectation where the 2 teams are going to make it now. There's really no drama going on. So you know what your finals is going to be. And again, they're going to have a gap to the start of their finals. So you kind of lose that momentum at times too, when you don't have those longer series. So I think it'd be interesting just to see. I haven't seen I've been kind of searching around for numbers. I think maybe there'll be, after these conference finals are done, there'll be something that comes out in terms of eyeballs and whatnot, and to see where that's gone, because I think it'll be, for especially in the States, those numbers I think will be very telling to see whether or not they've truly made a dent in this kind of non-hockey purist market. Because one thing I actually noticed, I'm not sure if you have watching the NBA games, is that they are both obviously with ESPN and TNT being the 2 big hitters with basketball. Same thing with hockey. They've been talking about the hockey all the time on the broadcasts and
Yeah,
kind of
everyone's
talking about the games.
peas.
Every time about the peas, yeah. Literally no one but Brooks calls the Panthers the peas. That was the worst little subtle drop by him. But
no doubt, I think they're becoming. There's more pop culture in hockey than there has been in the past ever before. Why? Honestly, I can't figure out exactly why that is.
Well, I honestly think it's their connection with the broadcasting partners with the NBA. I honestly think that. Like even there was, I don't know who was doing it or putting out the content, but essentially there was something where this little bit, it's going to be I'm not sure, like a little mini series thing on YouTube or whatever, but like the Stanley Cup and the Larry O'Brien trophy. And it's talking when Stanley met, or when Larry met Stanley. So the playoff of that movie. And they're going to have like some content. I'm assuming it's kind of a joint effort kind of thing. But like, I actually think it's maybe it's not outwardly talked about, but it seems like the NHL is aligning themselves with the NBA. And I know we talked about some potential issues with NBA growth, just given the kind of uncertainty around, or what the expectation was going to be with their next big TV contract, and that it might not be as lucrative as they first thought, just given how content is kind of augmenting itself and fracturing, as we've put it on recent podcasts. But at the same time, it's still, in comparison to, take the NFL out of the conversation, it's still a rocket ship in comparison to what the NHL has done. But now, NHL has made these inroads into their US television partners. They've seen a little bit of stickiness, I think. They've taken a new approach to having similar type content creation as the NBA in terms of having really good former players on panels and them being involved in content creation and kind of creating, again, more entertainment rather than just analysis. And all of that, to me, after watching kind of a year and a half or so of this, seems to me they're just aligning themselves with what the NBA has done and saying, hey, like let's piggyback on what they've done and maybe do some stuff with them. And because you're seeing like kind of Charles Barkley, he's a hockey fan. He chimes in every single time on the TNT broadcast. He's talking about hockey.
Yeah, that's got to be part of his deal, where he has to mention it, and as he should, probably.
Yeah, and he's lining his pockets. He doesn't give it.
No, lining his pockets. I actually think it's a good strategy from the broadcast.
Yeah.
They need to start to promote their other hours. Mm-hmm. The biggest reason why the NBA demands so much money is because of the timing in the schedule throughout the year. Right, you have it takes up a blank space. You have the NHL that falls in a very similar space, and if they can promote more people to come out and watch television during times in which there is no college football or the NFL, it's good for business. It's a good idea for them. That's what they're trying to do. So smart on their behalf. I think that you can kind of see this dynamic change where you have these major watch events that are incredibly powerful. And I kind of want to shift here to live golf and talk about the most recent PGA championship. But actually a Joe Pomp email newsletter he sent out, I think last week, where he discussed the economics of Topgolf, but more specifically, even at the beginning of the article, he talks about the PGA and the success of their major events. And I think this past weekend just changed a lot of minds with regards to what the next 15 years is going to look like for a top 50 professional golfer. And I'm going to read you a quoted tweet from Phil Mickelson, my favorite golfer. So,
Old fig
love,
jam.
live, or hate it, it's the best way / tour to be your best in the majors. Enough events to keep you sharp, fresh and ready, yet not be worn down from too many tournaments or obligations. There's 14 live events, 34 weeks left open to prepare for the 4 majors. And that is interesting. I understand how revenue is generated at these events. I mean, you need the ad space. The reason why Amazon is so incredibly efficient is because they have unlimited shelf space. There is only so much time in a day. There's only so many eyeballs, and there is a constrained amount and an infinite amount of competition. for that attention. It is very challenging. And I think that this is basically a mismatch of incentives from athletes over here that have a limited amount of time to make their money, limited amount of time to win their championships. And then you have these, the leagues and owners that have a longer duration, but also are fighting against this ever-changing entertainment space where you have Instagram, TikTok, this fracturing of the entertainment mirror that I talked about, where you have people that are finding their interests in so many different places. My wife's watching Selling Sunset and Vanderpump Rules, and then my son's watching Disney and the Young Jedi and like that sort of stuff. I'm watching golf and hockey and Succession. There's not a lot of overlap nowadays. And when it comes to what Phil is mentioning here, where you can get paid to do these 4 massive events with LIV, or 14, and then compete for what really matters for legacy in golf, it's going to change a few minds, I think, on the PGA Tour side. When you look at Rory McIlroy, who had to drop out of 2 major designated commitment events because he was mentally exhausted. I mean, Scotty made it. John Rahm had to pull out halfway through. These people are tired. I don't think it's easy to play 35 events, 4 days, make every cut, just so that you can draw people to come watch.
Yeah.
I think it's a challenge for these guys. It isn't, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's an amazing job to have. I don't think it's easy to do the full prep to play. I played a little bit of competitive golf growing up, and 2-day events, 3-day events, even as a young buck, drain you mentally. It's kind of like doing a playoff run over and over and over again.
Well, and I think the thing to take away from that, we always talk about the big boys, talk about top 50 or whatever. Like, what about all the guys grinding just to make a, like, quote unquote, just to make a living? I mean, like, maybe are earning a few $100,000, like now with the elevated events and purses being bigger. If you can get yourselves into those tournaments, like, yeah, maybe you're making a few $100,000 now, even if you're a top 150 golfer. But that's your gross earnings. I think you can find a bunch of stories online, videos about people on the tour grinding, getting to where they're getting to. Sure, sponsors cover a lot of stuff, but it's still a huge, like, travel commitment away from your family. Like, it's a very, I think it would be, again, as you pointed out, it's more on the mental side or psychological side more than anything. The physical side of golf, I think. We've had.
Just look at the bodies.
I agree. I agree. You have to be an athlete to play these days, but some of the folks out there aren't exactly hitting the gym 6 times a week in the off season. But I agree with you. I think the mindset. Now, I just want to make this clear because, like, I know I was, when LIV was first got announced, I was very much not necessarily completely against it, but just kind of arguing the points of the people who were against it. And I think taking the conversation about where the money's coming from and whether or not you have a problem with that, to how LIV is being funded, I think I want to take that out of the conversation for right now and just talk about, like, the concept of what LIV is. And I think I agree with you that it's now being shown, given the results of the Masters and PGA Championship. We got the US Open coming up, so we'll see if this is consistent or not. But you've had multiple people from the LIV Golf League be competitive in those tournaments. Brooks had a 54-hole lead heading into the Masters final round, choked it away, but was still right there. And then now he closed the deal on Sunday with now his 5th major championship, which again is going to get a lot of headlines, right? So I think, and then Bryson was up there. A couple others were on the first page of the leaderboard type thing, right? So yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you got the high level talent. Like, especially, like, there's some guys on LIV that definitely just took the bag.
Yeah, like Brooks's brother.
Yeah.
Why is he there?
Exactly.
Can barely hit.
But that's almost like that's just a sunk cost for LIV just to get the fields and what they need to do, right? But I think there has already been announcements about the PGA changing some things for next year. Like, they've essentially changed what their schedule and event programming looks like, I think, every year for the last 4 years.
Yeah.
So, like, they're going to essentially a designated event style next year where there's no cuts. only 70-man fields, etc., where you have to, like, the top 50 auto qualify, top 10 in the year auto qualify, and then there's 10 other ways to kind of get into the tournaments if you're other players. So like they're already taking bits and pieces of this. I assume and this is all like recency bias, our discussion here, like who knows, maybe Brooks and Bryson, like they've caught lightning in a bottle and all these guys completely fall off, and it's it's a non, it sputters out over time. But I think in terms of the concept of what golf could look like is a good conversation to have. And I think the PGA is already, and like, that like Rory was like, obviously he's the golden boy of the PGA right now. He was very much against all of this, the guys leaving, going to live. I think he as well was more so questioning right or wrong, whatever. I mean, it's probably, sometimes it's a bit of a ignorant comment to make, because like, where was his money coming from on some of his sponsors and where is it funded from? Like, he might not know. But in terms of questioning where the money's coming from for Liv, again, taking that outside of the conversation, he was very much against it publicly. Behind closed doors, he was telling the commissioner there, I think Jay Monahan's his name, of the PGA, we got to implement some of this stuff or we're going to lose more guys. So if you want me to stay, we got to do this. He's got his Tiger and Rory, that new thing in the fall, that indoor virtual golf thing. This has spurred very much what Phil said 18 months ago. There needs to be big change in what we're doing, adapt or die, essentially, from what PGA is doing from an entertainment standpoint. And this has spurred a lot of change in the last 12 months for them. And I think Joe had released, you had talked about, some of the Topgolf stuff and then some of the PGA notes. Outside of the first tournament of the year, or first two tournaments, I think, in the year, every other tournament has seen over a 10% increase in viewership.
It's wild. It's an unbelievable stat, actually. I don't know if there's a major sport that's growing at this pace. Obviously, small numbers compound faster.
Yep.
I mean, maybe the F1's growing faster than this, but really great to see. I think that what's most interesting for me, especially, and I think this is more applicable to our podcast that is turned into a sports cast, is how this applies to business, and then even somebody identifying opportunity inside of business, right? So I want to use an example here that Pomp points out, and it's Topgolf. For every person listening to this podcast that's been on a bachelor party, they've probably gone to a Topgolf. They've built something similar in Calgary very recently.
Yeah.
It sounds like they're expanding quickly, but Topgolf was founded in 2000 and very recently was acquired by Callaway Golf at a $2 billion valuation. They made three transactions, the first two, 2016 and 2018, and then they bought the remaining 86% in 2021 for that $2 billion number. And Topgolf now is doing $1.5 billion in revenue. That's pretty darn good for a little driving range. And I think the most interesting thing from my perspective is that they started much earlier, 2000. I was 10.
Yeah.
But with all that said, the real momentum began, call it 2017. And golf has really picked up momentum in the last 3 years, largely due to COVID. You have 36% growth in youth picking up the sport. Pretty impressive numbers. So if you're a business trying to get into a space, this is most certainly one of the faster growing athletic spaces.
Yeah.
It is growing its audience. It's getting bigger. I think that's largely because of the individual nature of it. You can see the people's faces. You can interact with their style, their fashion, the real things that you can build businesses off of, where I think has always been a huge struggle for the individual that wears a helmet. Somebody who's playing football or somebody in hockey, for that matter, right? Yeah. It's very difficult. It's hard to sell a sneaker when you wear a skate.
Yeah,
truly. 100%. So I feel for them.
I think the other thing that's interesting in the golf space, and so he talked about how Callaway purchased Topgolf, and then my brain just immediately went to our favorite YouTube channel, Good Golf, and so a bunch of 20-some-year-old guys started this. I think a couple of them obviously were maybe grinding on YouTube doing content stuff
from the time they were 15.
Yeah, but they really hit it big in the COVID years, and you can see it's kind of had this rocket ship of a in popularity online. They were kind of one of the originators. I think there's some guys out of Europe too that were really big into the space as well, but all of that has grown exponentially. And I think, again, to your point, it was one thing that you could do during those COVID years in terms of outside activity, when there were restrictions in a bunch of parts of the world. The ease of like the barrier to entry is, in terms of, I mean, buying a brand new set of TaylorMades is not like top of the line, is not cheap, but there's so many golf clubs out there. You can find a rental, you can find a used pair, pick them up. You can just do it. You can go out and do it. You don't need anything other than a club in your hand. You don't need anything else.
A driver depreciates faster than a Corvette. So.
Yeah. But you can see that obviously with Callaway purchasing Topgolf, Callaway's made big investment. They're now partnered with Good Golf. They've sponsored all these guys. TaylorMade's made huge investments into the YouTube golf space as well. Basically taking money out of going on to, maybe they sponsored, let's just call it 100 PGA Tour people previously. You're getting way more ad space time going with these, average Joe golfers on YouTube that are now going to be pumping your stuff that they're getting 500,000 views on videos with your TaylorMade product right in everybody's face, so in comparison to the guy who finishes 75th on the money list.
So just think about this. You have 500,000 views on a video that someone went and played 18 holes. They get 500,000 views on it.
Yeah, like an 18-minute video.
The final round of the Arnold Palmer had 3.2 million. So the only non-major on this list, or that has a enormous viewership, 4.1 million viewers tuned into the PGA, the Players Championship. The Players is like largest purse in golf, huge event. It's probably the 6th most important title to win. And for context, there are YouTubers that are getting larger audiences than these events are. This is a massive opportunity, and Topgolf is clearly making all the right decisions and kind of harnessing this, and then being a platform for events. Obviously, it's a restaurant. They're growing from a real estate perspective. I mean, Joe Pomp loves to point out that these things aren't profitable, but he I think misses the mark a lot of the time. In his piece, he talks about how the Topgolf is not producing a profit. Well, Amazon purposely doesn't produce a profit, and they're growing or adding 10 locations a year. Right now, there's 90 or 80 venues in 9 countries. Yeah, and I think that the real important metric to follow here is growth, and then them maintaining that per location revenue number and profitability number, so that they can justify that growth. The investors are getting the return on the growth of their equity, not on their profit to the bottom line. And that should be, for people reading Pomp, they should recognize that.
You got to always take the context of the stage, like the life cycle of that business into context, right? Like I think something like this will plateau at some point in terms of their growth and what they can be. I think that, again, they've caught a wave a little bit, I would say, in the last 3 years especially, in terms of the popularity growth. I think they're, like anything, there will be some plateauing. And I think that ultimately that's, again, what they are truly getting from their investment in, would Topgolf, like, where have they expanded all the way across the States? That's the only thing I know. It's 80 plus locations now, but is it kind of been centralized to like the lower half of,
where it's warm?
Yeah, essentially. Yeah,
probably.
Yeah, so I think that's one thing to consider with all of this. Like, I know
Calgary is not particularly warm.
I know, but I guess just like from an infrastructure standpoint, they'd have to kind of change things up to, I guess, continue the expansion, and like there would be barrier. Like we were talking about a town like Scottsdale having one. There's nothing but space, or at the time, like nothing but space to put one up. You're thinking about putting one in New York. It's like, what are you doing? You're building one off a tower, and
it's probably not economical to build one in Manhattan.
Yeah.
I would imagine that the
Staten Island
probably isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
You're going to need to build it either on a barge or 200 kilometers or miles inwards.
Yeah, I think that there becomes a point where that growth will not be the main focus.
No,
of
and
the
then
company.
they'll focus on profitability. It's
like everybody else right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just like every other company.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a great transition, I think, to a market update. And last week was, I don't know, somewhat less interesting than it was the previous week. The way things have been going is it's kind of just a continued grind higher when you look at U.S. equities, but more specifically the NASDAQ and the top 10 contributors to the S&P 500. It's just been a flight to safety in names that everybody recognizes, into the profitable, into the businesses that are able to cut staff. With all that said, you go and you look at the large revenue benefiters from the COVID period. So think Home Depot, et cetera. They have really started to pull back, and they're anticipating there being contractions in their year-over-year numbers and quarter-over-quarter even. And that's concerning for sure. It does speak to the shift in consumption and rotation back to where we were pre-COVID, more that 2018, 2019 period. But at the same time, we're getting mixed signals for sure. And the rhetoric and the financial headlines are now shifting to there being a debt ceiling crisis in the United States. In Canada, I think the headlines that are the news that's grabbing headlines is more around our housing crisis and interest rates. The 5-year Canadian bond went up 50 basis points early this week and end of last week. What does that mean? It went from like 2.98 to 3.48 or 3.45. That means that 5-year fixed term mortgages are going to be more expensive than they probably were 2 weeks ago. So it's this mixed market that's incredibly challenging. I think I mentioned last week, and in all my conversations with clients and prospects, this is the hardest market to put money to work in, just because valuations are high, volatility is low, but uncertainty is not being priced in the way in which we saw it last year, where you had the VIX index that I talked about incessantly, hovering in the high 20s, low 30s for a good portion of the year, whereas this year it's at 17. It's below average. And it's odd for sure. So what I think most people are probably going to see over the next 6 to 8 weeks, as we inch closer to what is probably required to be some sort of action on the policy front from the United States government and Congress and passing a new debt ceiling.
Yeah, June 1st, I think the Yellen said.
Sort of, right?
Yeah.
We can revert back to history. And the last time we had a crisis like this, it was when a Democrat was in power in 2011 with Obama. And during that time period, it went right down to the wire. It was definitely scary. From just markets were uncertain. Right now, we're not pricing in there being any sort of
issue.
2011-esque issue.
Yeah.
But you're starting to see spikes in short-term U.S. Treasury rates versus what they probably should be. There is now what they call a credit gap and a spread there that you wouldn't usually see. And I think that investors are going to continue to be scared about this. I know in our internally, we're reading a lot of stuff about this, just the info coming from major research banks, et cetera. And it's something to talk to your advisor and your portfolio manager about. I think personally, it would be weird for them not to come to some sort of resolution here. But it's not unlike the Republicans to push it to the wire on purpose to get what they want. And with all that said, what does it mean? I mean, quite honestly, if you look back at the 2011 period, what did really well? Gold did incredibly well during that period, same with silver. But so did equities to an extent. It was volatile, no doubt. Actually, at one point, I think the S&P 500 was down close to 16 or 17% through that summer.
Yep.
Because the resolution didn't come till August. So you definitely need to be paying attention. The market it snapped back after the fact. But again, the snapback from 2011 to 2012 is going to be different than 2023 to 2024. And you definitely have to be on it. I'm going to be watching this. I'm sure I'm going to be talking about it more on this podcast. I didn't think we would get to the summer. I thought that this was a nothing burger. I still think generally this is a nothing burger from just it's weird that the United States would cut off their nose to spite their face.
Yeah.
Like, why would you go through this? Why would you put into question your credit quality? Why is it that they do this? I mean,
I'm sure it's because they want you to look over here while something else is happening on the other side.
Exactly. Maybe it's while they push forward Ron DeSanctimonious and Donald Trump. I don't know what's going on. Maybe it's because the Fox News and CNN are falling apart at the seams. They're paying fines like it's nobody's
Left,
business.
right, and center, yeah.
I don't know.
It's, what I got out of that is buy Bitcoin. And
that is not financial advice at all.
Especially not for me. So I say that in jest. But I think it's interesting for you to say about what the market's telling us or what these indexes are telling us in terms of volatility and the pricing in of uncertainty, et cetera. Because like me as a semi-educated investor and someone who would look at this is like, just looking at things from afar, I can't think of a time in my life where I've been more uncertain about what the next 6 months is going to look like.
Seriously?
Oh, for sure. And again, this might just be you shared an item this morning. This is Canadian specific, and I think maybe we'll get into more details next week because realistically, it was something that Joel and I looked at for about a minute and a half before recording. But the home equity line of credit numbers in Canada skyrocketing year over year. What was the other item? 107%.
Mortgage liabilities as a share of total assets.
As a share of total assets. So there's these kind of underlying things happening, which, I mean, there's numbers on. And inflation, I feel like we've talked about it every week essentially for 8 or 12 months now, call it.
Yeah, 2
9
years.
months for sure in real good context. And you can get a new viewpoint on that every week if you search it out, and someone saying that it's the end of the world and others saying that it's expected, etc. And you have, I mean, from a political standpoint, I mean, locally, obviously we have which we're going to get to in a second here, I think, but we have a local election coming up that how that goes could sway things a decent amount in this province. In the U.S., we're getting into election season. As you pointed out earlier, people are putting in their presidential bids on the Republican side as we speak. And we talk about I said this before we started recording as well. We're essentially, we're 1 or 2 more world events away from that volatility number going off the board. And I'm not sure about you, but I've been keeping track of all these one-time world events or once-in-a-generation world events that we've been seeing, and that number's higher than 1 over the past few years. So again, how do you predict that? You can't. I think obviously the markets the general sentiment around it is going to be based off of history and based off of more concrete items, whereas my perception of volatility or uncertainty out there would be more based off of my feeds. And it's easy to fall into that spiral. But it is interesting, again, and maybe for some of our listeners too, to hear where that uncertainty, volatility index sentiment is currently sitting, because I think a lot of that could change easily over the next few months, given just what we've seen over the past 12. But
no, I completely agree with you. It's
fun time for you, though. You get to answer all those calls, and you get to...
the best time to build business is when things are bad. I had my best years from 2020 to 2022, and I don't anticipate that when things are great, I'm going to get as many calls with people that are upset with where they're currently at. So bring on the bad times. But with all that said, I hope for a soft landing, no doubt. The last thing I want is especially as someone who works predominantly with business owners, and it's not easy to build and then maintain through these times. And I from my perspective, when I look at the United States and then the Canadian market, it's, as we mentioned, it is a tale of two stories, truly. We aren't experiencing the same political volatility, while maybe we are inching to a similar way in which we handle or promote our politicians, I still think that there's unique problems here that aren't necessarily as prevalent there. So, I mean, in the current election coming up here, I mean, I kind of today wanted to talk about what our predictions might be. And this is me not speaking or talking my book here. I have no idea still how I'm voting, but it's just showing to me that, I mean, the Alberta economy is strong, stable, relative to the rest. The debt ceiling, that conversation in the United States, the fact that they're, as a percentage of GDP, are now well above 100%. There is concerns or cause for concern. The All In podcast can't go in an episode without talking about these constraints, these problems, the interest rates, and the interest costs as a percentage of the budget. They can't stop talking about it. Whereas in Canada, I think most of that is actually on the consumer side. It's more on the person who's participating in the economy where the issue is.
Well, and I mean, who spurred that issue? But
don't get me
conversation
wrong.
for another day.
It's hard for me to say even
not
blame,
who, but like what actions led to that? Which, I mean, spurred by the government.
We have, in my opinion, plenty of problems, but the only one that really matters is housing. And we need policy around it that actually solves the supply. And it's all that I would vote on if it was up to me. It's the only thing that, in my opinion, one, solves our demographic issue. It solves the equality problem, where a large majority of wealth is derived from household wealth and the growth or owning a home. I mean, that's where most people build the majority of their nest egg. It contributes to standard of living increases, stability. You have opportunity, help, a healthy community. All of those things stem from home ownership. And right now I'm continuing to see from economists, people that are commenting on the space, they're talking about 45-year mortgages, 60-year mortgages. CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage Institute, whatever, housing something. Anyways, they keep talking about the balance sheet concerns and as a percentage of people's incomes, how much interest costs are taking up. This is all being solved with new TFSAs, where it's not being solved with supply. And I don't know what it's going to take to get somebody to do something about this. But for me, I'm watching our provincial election right now, and everyone's talking about how no one's addressing housing. Nobody.
It's not really a hot button
It's
thing.
not a hot button issue. It still is healthcare issues, and it's education. And like, don't get me wrong, our children matter, and all of those things are important. But for me as a voter, I think the last election, they did a very good job taking care of childcare. It was a great advancement that I think everybody, especially millennials, should be happy about.
Yeah.
But I mean,
it's an easy thing to market, right? Too, like that one. But it's such a small, like when you, in the whole scheme of things, it's just a small number in terms of like that spend.
100%.
In terms of like from a budget perspective, et cetera. It's not a huge one. So I think we won't necessarily break this down. Joel had dug up this great graphic, which I think you'll share in the newsletter, maybe
from Trevor Tomb.
Okay, yeah. So it's a great visual for seeing in our case, the government of Alberta 2023 budget and seeing the ins and the outs. Then, I'm not going to harp on this very much, but people in general, myself included, love to complain about obviously what's affecting them and how a government budget or changes to a tax code or whatever it might be might change them or might affect them individually. And it's like, well, why can't they just why can't they just get rid of this or reduce personal tax or reduce corporate tax? Like, why does this keep going up, indexing, whatever it might be? It's a balancing scale when it comes to a government's budget, right? Like, sure, yeah, we can do we won't go into our federal government budget and that, because that would be a bit more of a
more difficult.
Be a bit more difficult and a bit more of a discussion about large deficits. But the Alberta 2023 budget, I think it's $2.3 billion surplus is what was projected. Now, I know a lot of that we talked about last week too.
$75 oil.
We need that $75 oil. But just looking at this, you can see, okay, like truly at this time, I would think from a fiscal standpoint, it would make sense to be balanced as much as possible and or curb that spending as much as possible, or at least focus that spending on the things that really matter. And as you point out, like, I mean, health, education, child services, social services, etc. We can have debates back and forth. We could have, if we wanted to, we could have guests on here that could speak to all the things that money should be spent on. But I can't agree more with you that none of these things matter if we don't have a strong housing system. So Alberta, we talked, I mean, I can't remember, that must have been 6-9 months ago, we talked about the projected immigration numbers or the opportunity for immigration numbers into this country and how big of an opportunity Alberta had specifically in relation to that. And Edmonton, from me hearing about kind of residential development in our two major centers here in this province, we have nothing but opportunity to be able to follow this through. So there needs to be policy around this supporting the fact that we need to build this infrastructure. And, you know, not sky's the limit might be kind of the wrong sentiment to have, because we do have a dependence still on our cash cow in this province, but we're continuing to see some more diversification there. And that diversification can only get better if we continue to build out our population and the availability for housing. So I can't agree more in general with that sentiment. And it is not being talked about enough. But again, it's not an easy thing to talk about sometimes, because it is more of a future oriented planning thing. Whereas we all know now, for the most part, when you're going through a political campaign, I'm sure you listened or watched at least a clips of the debate between Rachel and Danielle Smith last week. It's all the here and now, or talking about history, about how the other person screwed up. And so, you know, Danielle talking about how the NDP screwed up before she got in, and then Rachel talking about how the UCP has been screwing up since they've been in. So it's a lot of back and forth on that, and because that's what sells, and that's what's easy enough to give across in content right now. Mm-hmm. It's talking about quick hitter things. You really have to, as a voter, like, you have to dig into what all this policy stuff means and what their actual positions are on these things. So like following, you had mentioned Mel Cowett's newsletter, like that, what a great resource to be able to kind of dig into more information and understand where, you know, certain policy positions are coming from. Because what you're going to get on Twitter or on Global News, and I mean, they're doing their jobs. Like, I mean, all that stuff is relevant, and it is content and stuff that is out there. But in terms of, you're never going to get a leader to stand up and give a 45-minute presentation about, this is my plan for housing.
Well, no one's going to watch it.
Exactly. But like that. But if we're going to be honest about what's important, that would be important for everyone to understand. But number one, 70% of people don't care.
Yep.
So, and for the people that do, like, it's harder to get that information, understand. It's like, well, what is your position on this, and what are we going to do about it?
And quite frankly, the biggest, I think, something that we probably don't think too much about is the fact that these politicians are in for 4 years, and mm-hmm. housing policy is going to impact 15 years down the road.
100%.
But
it should be this should be something that should be like, it shouldn't be I always say bipartisan and partisan the wrong way, but this should be a group think.
Everybody should be in agreement
on a go forward basis, right? So it's like, get your butts moving on this. Like, no, it doesn't matter if you're Liberal, NDP, UCP, whatever it might be. We all want to have an economy that moves forward into the next 100 years, and we want to be well positioned globally in order to do that. So we need to make the investment in there. It shouldn't matter. I mean, they're going to fight about all the nuts and bolts anyways, no matter how it runs down. But generally speaking, there needs to be more of a focus on that, more dialogue around it.
No, I totally agree with you. Moving into recommendations for the week, I have not a lot, but I did want to speak to something. It was super weird that this happened to me, but I was listening to a Founders episode that was produced, I don't know, maybe it was 3 weeks ago, maybe it was a month ago, mm-hmm. and it was about Sam Zell. And he is, I don't know, objectively the most successful commercial real estate investor to ever live. Mm-hmm. He had a lunch with the guy who produces Founders. Founders is a Invest Like the Best Colossus podcast.
Yeah.
And so it's very well done. The guy who does it goes insanely deep, reads all of the autobiographies, biographies, books about these people or people in those industries, and does an episode. And he did one on Sam Zell about commercial real estate and how he built his fortune and his business. And he went for lunch with Sam Zell probably a month ago, 6 weeks ago. And the guy died last week. And after that episode, there was a ton of, we'll call it Twitter threads talking about all the things that he has done. And for me, it was kind of shocking, but as somebody who's trying to focus more on commercial real estate and understand it better, as more of my clients are interested in doing it or are doing it or are the benefactors financially from success in it, it was a really great podcast to listen to. It was also sad to hear him on the podcast, and then two, passing away a few weeks later. It kind of hit home how short life is. Really great podcast. I don't like recommending it because then people will stop listening to me, I think, because it's that much better. But that's my reco for the week. I have a lot of really great things to read. For those that are interested in the wealth transfer, I have a great piece from the New York Times that I shared, and just speaking to what's going to happen in the next 2 decades. So for anybody who's trying to build a business, servicing that industry is going to be important. Obviously, I'm interested in it because I think I directly benefit from a business momentum perspective, but there's tons of opportunity, whether it be old folks' homes to estate planning to accounting. There's a ton of work there. So those are my recos. You got anything?
I just started. I'm not fully through it yet. Listening on the way here, but again, not to I guess push people towards other podcasts. But Biz Breakdown and the Colossus, Restoration Hardware was there. It just got released like last night, so I was listening to it this morning. We've talked about it a few times, obviously, and just kind of an interesting dynamic of their company and how they've changed direction in terms of how they're presenting themselves, I guess. And so it's been interesting so far. So again, it's such a great, some of those podcasts are a bit longer in nature, but for the most part, like you get kind of a good synopsis of information in a short amount of time with those.
Do you think Gary Friedman is insane?
Don't you have to be?
Yeah, probably. For context, Gary Friedman's the CEO, and I wouldn't call him a founder because he bought it, but of Restoration Hardware. All of the marketing ideas are his. The way that he's kind of stolen from Apple, I think, when building shrines to their product. He's 65 and just going ham still. It's so interesting. I work with so many people that are just dead set on retiring at 55. And then you see all of these people that are 65 and they're just getting started.
It's those killers still.
An absolute killer.
Yeah.
And I listened to that podcast, the Compound podcast, 3 or 4 weeks ago, where it talked about if you lived to 2030, you're likely going to live to 120. It just, Gary Friedman's only just past his halfway
point. Yeah.
So,
it's an interesting one. Again, I read a bunch about Sam Zell after you had mentioned too. So I think that's a good recommendation on your side for that podcast. And like, even just for those who like to learn about, I don't know, this, it's just interesting because like I had never really heard, I had maybe seen the name a couple times, but didn't know anything about him. Not highly marketed in terms of general understanding of who he is and what he did. And a pretty interesting life. So it's definitely worth the listen to.
All right, man. Catch you next Wednesday.
I guess so. We're a hump day podcast now. Check you later.